think we've just gone past sort of 9 o'clock now, so I can see there's still a few people joining, but I think it's right for us to make a start now. As ever, we'll try and be disciplined around the timings. We've put it until sort of 10 a.m. this morning. We'll certainly make sure that we're sort of wrapped up by then, possibly a little bit before. So welcome everyone that's joined us already. This is now a pretty long-running annual event that we've done in conjunction with the Bank of England. Delighted again to be joined by Paul Mountain this morning. He's very kindly given up his time to come and talk to us, give us some of the latest views from the Bank of England. Clearly, there's a lot going on in the economy right now. I think it's a really sort of interesting time to have, Paul host this for us, and an opportunity as ever to put some questions to him. So please do remember that hopefully at the bottom of your screen you can see on the taskbar there the sort of Q&A box. So if you click on the Q&A function at any time during Paul's presentation this morning, you'll be able to submit a question through, and towards the end I'll be putting those questions to Paul, putting him on the spot a little bit, giving him a good grilling. So hopefully you've had your coffee this morning, Paul, and you're wide awake and ready to field those questions. So I think without further ado, then I'll hand over to Paul to guide us through his presentation this morning, and then we'll pick up Q&A at the end. So Paul, over to you.
That's great. Thanks, Pete. I'll probably try and get through the slides in about 20 minutes, because I'm sure that there's already some questions, some good questions I know come in. I'm sure there'll be more, so it's nice to have time for a bit of questions and a bit of discussion as well. So I work in the bank's Yorkshire Humber Agency. I'm one of the bank's agents, and the agents across the country basically have two roles. One is we talk to businesses about how they see the economy, what their business challenges are, and we theme that information across the country, and we feed in the key messages to the people at the bank who set interest rates, and that information, that up-to-date narrative about what's actually going on in the economy is really valued with them and has a big impact on their interest rate decisions. The other part of the role is doing things like this, which is explaining to business leaders like those of you on the call what the bank's doing and why it's doing it. So the bank's a government-owned body. We're a public institution, essentially, with a dual mission, which is set by government, which is around maintaining monetary and financial stability. It's the monetary stability bit, the trying to keep inflation at a low and stable level, which I'm going to talk about today. So a little bit about how we try and influence inflation and what the sort of process at the bank is. So we operate under a government mandate. The government sets an inflation target for us, and they set that target to say, we want you to keep the consumer price index, which is a broad measure of inflation. Lots and lots of different household sort of goods are included in it, and the target is 2%. The idea for 2% is that it's good to have a small amount of positive inflation, because if you target 0 and you're a bit below, then actually you end up in sort of negative inflation, and people stop spending, and the economy almost grinds to a halt. And of course, we also want stable inflation as well, because that really helps. Low and stable inflation helps consumers and businesses, make decisions for the long term and plan with a degree of certainty. So the one lever we have to influence inflation is something called the base rate, or the interest rate. Bank rate is sometimes called. So it's basically the key interest rate in the economy. And when we change that interest rate, that generally very quickly feeds through into interest rates that commercial banks and other financial institutions will offer to their customers. In economics terms, it's really quite a simple concept, in the sense that lots of you, I'm sure, would have done GCSE economics, A-level economics, maybe degrees, maybe O-level economics if you're as old as me. It's all about influencing demand, to bring demand in the economy broadly into balance with supply. And when you do that, you get price stability. So we're using the interest rate to influence demand. It's a bit about the process. The interest rate is set 8 times a year. So we have something called a Monetary Policy Committee, which has 9 independent members, 5 from within the bank and 4 external appointees. They meet 8 times a year, and they, at that point, are able to increase, decrease, or leave interest rates where they are. 4 times a year, that forecast is informed. That interest rate decision is informed by an updated forecast produced by the bank staff. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about the forecast that we published a couple of weeks ago. One thing I will always stress is that in terms of using the interest rate to influence demand in the economy and therefore inflation, there's always a time lag between changing the interest rate and feeding through into economic activity. So I suppose the obvious example is that most people these days are on fixed rate mortgages. So we changed the interest rate today. Let's say we've been increasing interest rates. If you're on a variable rate, you very quickly see an impact on your spending. So your debt servicing costs are higher, so you're spending less. So demand in the economy is lower. But obviously, with a lot of people on longer-term fixed-rate mortgages, that effect takes time to feed in, because it doesn't feed in for people until actually they have to come to refinance their mortgage. This very busy chart is just really telling the sort of story of inflation over the last 5 years, and I'll just pick out a few things from it. So the white line is the sort of headline inflation rate, and then the bars, which are labelled, show various different contributions. Broadly, in the consumer price index, services is about half the index. So things like restaurants, hotels, transport, telecom services, and so on. And then goods is also about half the index. So we've broken out food there, which is a significant one. We also, household utilities, we also count as goods. And then lots of other goods like furniture and so on, which are in the sort of blue bar at the top. So thinking back to during COVID, during 2020, we were actually quite concerned about inflation becoming negative. And you might remember that the bank cut interest rates to 0.1%. And at that point, the government was also pumping a lot of money into the economy through things like the furlough scheme to try and keep consumers spending, keep unemployment down, and stop business failures. And that was actually quite successful. And during 2021, we started to see goods inflation come through, and that was broadly because we couldn't go out and eat, or we couldn't go out on holiday. People still, the real incomes were maintained largely because of government support and also the low interest rates. So demand for goods in the economy increased quite steeply. That also happened globally because in big economies like the United States, they were doing similar sort of fiscal programs to try and keep the economies moving. And likewise had lockdowns, so people couldn't consume services. So very high demand globally for goods, and supply was negatively impacted because a lot of goods come from countries like China and Vietnam, where they had very, very tough COVID lockdowns. So you had factory closures and so on. So high demand, low supply. Not surprisingly, we started to see goods inflation coming through, and that was the sort of story of early 2021. What we started to see as well at that point was services price inflation starting to increase. So, at various times things were open and the labour market was very tight. We started seeing a bit of an uptick in wage inflation. So we started to see what we sort of call persistence or second round effects with services prices, which are more domestically have more domestic cost bases, particularly labour. Those prices started to increase too. We then had the Russia-Ukraine shock, which led to a large increase in energy prices in sort of spring 2022. You can see that through the orange bars on the chart. And then we started to have lots of indirect effects from that. So, for example, very, very high food inflation, largely driven by very, very high energy prices. So, a big part of food production costs are energy. And at one point, I think during the middle of 2022, we had food price inflation running, at 20% or so. The bank started increasing interest rates in December 21, so that started to take sort of some of the heat out of the economy. And we also found that as because inflation is a 12-month index, as you move forward, some of those shocks from COVID and from the energy price increases started to fall out of the index. So even though, let's say, energy prices increased a lot 12 months ago and you've got a very big jump in inflation, if everything stays the same, 12 months later, actually, energy isn't contributing to inflation at all, even though the energy price is a lot higher. So it's a change measure and it's a 12-month index. So inflation started to come down, peaked in October 22, and actually the figure today, which was published for April, is 2.3%, which was a big drop on the March figure of 3.2%. And that's largely driven by household energy price cap coming down. So we do actually have inflation now quite close to target. And don't worry, I will come on to explain why the bank has been very cautious in terms of cutting interest rates, despite the fact that we now have inflation back to close to target. So that's just a little bit about the story of inflation in the last few years. Here, just showing the response in terms of the interest rate rise. I talked about increasing from December 21, generally increasing pretty gradually, but quite consistently through. I think it was till August 23 was when we started holding rates, and at that point the interest rate was up to 5.25%, which in recent historical terms is high, but because on a longer term horizon, those of you with longer memories, it's a fairly sort of normal rate. I think it's the period since the financial crisis when rates were below 1% in longer term historical terms is unusual, rather than the rate at sort of 5%ish being unusual. In terms of the bank's forecast, this chart is picking out, the first three rows really are picking out the three sort of key economic variables that we forecast, and because everybody will be interested in. So you've got GDP, CPI, CPI inflation, and the unemployment rate. I've talked about inflation being broadly back at target. You can see that from the 2024 Q2 measure, which has got inflation at 2%. We actually think inflation will increase a little later in the year, and then we'll drop back over the forecast horizon. We always do this sort of three-year forecast, as shown in the chart, shown in the table. Sorry. GDP, we've got a bit of GDP growth starting to come through. Nothing particularly spectacular in historical terms. At the end of the forecast period, we think GDP growth will be around sort of 1.5%. We're not expecting unemployment to increase to very high levels. I mean, again, those of you with longer memories will know that unemployment under 5% is very low in historical terms. So we're expecting, quite a tight labour market going forward. The thing I always stress in these forecasts is that we always, as an input and as an assumption into the forecasting model, we always use the current market expectations of where bank rate, interest rate will be. So this forecast incorporates a rate cut. This is the bottom row, from 5.25% today to 3.75% at the end of the forecast period, and that's purely conditioned on what markets currently think is going to happen to interest rates. That's not a prediction from the bank. That's the market curve, essentially. In terms of what's driving the pickup in GDP, I think we saw a big fall in real incomes over the last sort of couple of years, but real incomes are now increasing because inflation has come back, and we've had quite a lot of wage growth still. The savings rate is ticking up a bit. People ran down savings following COVID, but that's now starting to pick up. That's on the right-hand side. So there's a general sense in terms of the GDP improvement that a lot of that's driven by a sort of recovery in consumer spending. Certainly the consumer confidence metrics suggest that consumers are slowly getting sort of more confident in terms of financial position and so on, and we'd expect consumer spending to increase. Investment intentions at the moment, I speak to lots of businesses in the region, and we do that across the country. The general sense, I think, is that firms are cautious generally on investment, but also, I think as the economy, as inflation comes back, as interest rates start to fall, we'd expect firms to be, or the forecast shows that, we expect firms to be investing more as well. The housing market, I always try and throw something in on the housing market because it's of interest to a lot of people directly, but it can also have a really big impact on confidence and spending, consumer spending in the economy. The general sense, and this chart is just showing the sort of price indices, the general sense is that house prices have been pretty flat. And there's some tentative signs of a return to growth. And I think when we speak to people, house builders or estate agents, they'd sort of confirm that sense that the housing market has bottomed out, and they're expecting a sort of gradual recovery. That helps to support things like consumer spending and obviously investment in sort of house building and so on. In terms of policy messages, so every time the Bank of England interest rate setting committee meets, they publish a sort of set of measures or sort of bullet points about why they're doing what they're doing. So just looking at, I've picked out a few here from the last meeting in May. So broadly explaining that the inflation's coming back, but that is in part due to those sort of large increases in goods prices sort of to dropping out of the index essentially. There is a sense that the labour market is loosening, but from a very, very tight position. That is helping to reduce inflationary pressure, but sort of slowly. The labour market, is still tight, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Thinking about sort of when the bank will cut interest rates, and I'll say more about this, but broadly, when they're thinking about how to use the interest rate to hit the inflation target, they're trying to ignore sort of external shock effects and think about, what's the underlying inflation in the economy. And at the bottom, they're talking about the measures of sort of persistent inflationary pressures and domestic inflation that they really monitor. And the three key measures or three key areas of the economy they look at are tightness in the labour market, wage growth, and services price inflation. And services price inflation because it tends to be more driven by domestic factors, which aren't external shocks to the economy, which in a sense the interest rate can't really sort of impact quickly. So in terms of some of those factors that the committee is very focused on, I just thought I'd pick out a few sort of slides to sort of give you a sense of some of the evidence they look at when they're thinking about, is it time to change interest rates? So this is something that the bank agents did. This slide is showing a survey of firms that the agents talked to. You've got 2023 and 2024 results, and it's showing a sort of range of different factors which impact on wage settlements and the extent to which firms can say they're sort of pushing up or reducing wage pressures. And I suppose the overall picture here is that 2024, most of the factors, with the exception of changes in the minimum wage, are impacting less in an upwards direction. So there's a sense of sort of wage pressure falling back, although still being at quite historically high levels. There's also, I think, a sense that firms' pricing power or confidence in increasing prices to reflect higher costs, particularly higher wages, is starting to sort of wane a little bit. And I think in terms of our discussions with firms now, firms are more cautious about raising prices because of the impact it might have on demand. And in terms of trying to sort of maintain margins and keep the business going well in terms of profitability, they're perhaps more focused on sort of cost reduction and trying to be really, really smart on sort of reducing costs as a a different way to sort of keep margins up. So the labour market measures, one of the key metrics that the interest rate committee looks at is the vacancies to unemployment ratio. That's shown on the right-hand side, and broadly, you can see during the last couple of years, we've actually had at various times more vacancies in the labour market than people unemployed, which shows a very, very tight labour market. So that ratio was above 1. We're now down to just above 0.6, which is very similar to 2019. So the labour market has loosened, but I think it's always worth remembering that, in 2019, we were then talking about a very tight labour market, and we had quite significant wage inflation still at that time. So the labour market is still tight, but it is loosening. And in terms of services inflation directly, there is definitely an easing in services inflation. So as I said, this is things like sort of restaurant prices, holidays, hotels, transport, and so on. But actually, services inflation is sort of coming back very, very gradually, and that this is a key metric that the committee will look at in terms of thinking when is the time right for cutting rates. So that's coming back slowly. So we're going to do a couple of polls now. So I thought it would be good to do a couple of polls based on the key things that the Monetary Policy Committee look at when setting rates. So here's the first one, and I think Robert from Horsens is going to run this for us. So I think I'm going to hand over to you at this point, Robert. Robert, Pete, I hope you can hear me. I can't see anything coming up on the screen around a poll, but maybe participants
Okay.
can.
I think hopefully I've got it on screen, Paul. So if I can just run you through then. So in terms of the 0 to 2% choice, we've got 9% believing that's where they'll sort of see it. The majority, so just under 2/3, suggesting between 2 and 4%. 26% between 4 and 6, and then just 2% now showing over 6%, which obviously is much lower than where we've probably seen it in the last 12 months.
That is, and I think that will be music to the ears of the committee. I think in terms of feels like wage pressures are definitely coming down. I would have thought 12 months ago we'd probably have had 2/3 in the 4 to 6% range. So look, thank you. So moving on, we've got the next one. So I can't see what's going on with the poll, Pete. So just let me know when the results are in.
Okay, results now in then, Paul. So very small proportion, just 2%, expecting their employment levels to be significantly lower than as at present, and a similarly sort of small percentage, just 6%, saying a little lower. Then perhaps understandably, 42% and 47% saying either about the same or a little higher than now, respectively. And again, just a small fraction, 4%, saying significantly higher than at present.
Thank you. Thanks, Pete. And I think that's pretty consistent with what we hear, I suppose, across the country, that broadly the labour market's still tight. We're not getting indications that people are looking to significantly cut labour force. A lot of firms say they're still trying to hold on to people because it's been so difficult to recruit. But there is a general sense maybe that wage pressure is coming down, which I think, from those of you wanting to see lower interest rates, which is probably most of you, is good news. So just before we move to questions, I'll just say a little bit about where financial markets thinks rates are going. So every morning I get a sort of update from the bank's sort of financial markets team about what the current market curve shows for future interest rates. It always surprises me that it moves around a lot. So a few days ago, the market was 50-50 for a rate cut in June. so a 0.25% cut, roughly half and half, expecting hold versus a small cut. And then there was a very strong sense that there would be another 0.25% cut in August. Because the inflation, although the inflation number came in low today at 2.3%, that number was actually above where markets thought the number would be. So I think the average market expectation was that inflation would be 2% for April. It was actually 2.3%. And that's actually shifted, financial market expectations of rates out. So actually now financial markets aren't expecting a rate cut until September at 0.25% and another one in November. So ending the year 0.5% lower. Now that moves around a lot, and I think the Monetary Policy Committee will always say, we are very focused on the data. They will be very focused on that wage data, on the employment data, the labour market tightness and services prices, and they will make their decision really, I think, based on how they feel that data is changing. So look, I shall stop sharing my slides now, and then we can get into some Q&A.
Okay, thanks very much for taking us through that, Paul. Interesting as ever to understand a little bit more, I suppose, about the sort of dynamics, the mindset, the thinking within the Bank of England, what drives some of that sort of decision making. And I think particularly your comments just there as well, just understanding how sensitive the markets are right now as well to relatively kind of small differences in some of that data, just 0.3% on inflation, suddenly shifting the expectations out by, sort of 3-4 months in terms of when there might be some interest rate adjustments. So yeah, really interesting stuff. Thank you, Paul. So as ever, just a reminder then, at the bottom of your screens, you should hopefully see the Q&A box. We have got some questions coming through already. We had a few submitted in advance, so we'll waste no further time in getting stuck into those. So Paul, one question here then. Earlier on, a few months ago, there were some critics out there sort of saying that the bank had been sort of far too slow in raising interest rates initially to help combat that inflation curve that you demonstrated to us in the slides earlier on. So do you think within the bank, is that an opinion that they might share, that they feel that actually retrospectively that they were a little bit slow in sort of raising rates? And do you think that might sort of influence the strategy when it comes to reducing rates now that we've seen inflation ease?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of comments I've heard, particularly from one of the policymakers who I was able to speak to. They visit the region a lot, so we're able to speak to them at length at some times. I think the feeling was in the sort of mid 2021 when inflation was starting to increase, but COVID was still present and the furlough scheme was still in place, that there was consideration in the committee about raising rates, and people concerned about inflation rising. And that one of the reasons why they held off was that the furlough scheme was still in place, and there was a concern that unemployment would increase quite significantly when the furlough scheme ended. The labour market would be very loose, and that you would almost, by raising interest rates, tightening policy at that point, you would almost sort of make that worse and actually sort of damage any sort of recovery that was coming through. I mean, as it turned out, the furlough scheme ended and unemployment didn't really increase at all. The labour market stayed incredibly tight. So I think the sort of sense might be, well, maybe with hindsight, they might have gone a bit earlier, but they didn't have hindsight. And again, it's very data driven. The data at that time, I think, was making them quite cautious about increasing rates at that point when the economy was still quite fragile. I mean, I think in terms of now, the decision will be based on their interpretation of the data that's coming through on the labour market, on wages and on services. I think that will be broadly absolutely key to it. My general sense is now, I mean, the voting at the last committee was 7 for hold and 2 for reduce. I think it's getting quite balanced for some of those people, quite finely balanced for some of those people who are on hold, but because there'll be different views across the 9 members, financial markets are clearly pretty confident that we will see a cut at some point this year. I think the question is just when, and that will be very data driven, I think.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Again, something you just touched on briefly during the presentation was around, how quickly sometimes the bank's movements in rates can have an impact on the economy because of the fact that we have a lot of fixed rates in terms of household borrowings. Majority of people these days tend to be on fixed rates for their mortgages. So this question sort of picks up on that theme and says that, would the bank prefer to see more people on fixed for life mortgages to help reduce consumers' exposure to interest rates, or would the view be that that would actually be counterproductive and obviously blunt the tools that the Bank of England has at its disposals?
Yeah, I don't think we'd express an opinion on, on any sense of policy in the mortgage market of, should we be offering longer term mortgages? I'm not even sure. Maybe that's something that you might do with government support. I know in the States they have a lot, they're able to offer longer term mortgages. If I'm really honest, I don't quite know how they manage to do it with that degree of sort of certainty. But I think the point is well made that actually it would reduce the impact of the interest rate, because if let's say if everyone was on a fixed rate mortgage for life, it would mean that that part of that transmission mechanism of either giving people more money in their pockets or reducing money in their pockets would be blunted. I think that's absolutely right.
Thanks, Paul. And again, I think there's a little bit that you touched on in the presentation here, but maybe we can just expand on it a bit further. Is that obviously, as you talked about, some of the key drivers behind the inflation that we've experienced have been sort of imported, goods or imported items in general. That might be sort of fuel and other raw materials as opposed to goods specifically. But can you just perhaps give a little bit of insight into, sort of the bank's views, the bank's thoughts on how sort of, domestically raising our interest rates impacts on those things that are clearly outside of the
Yeah.
UK shores?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it doesn't impact on them directly. So, changing the interest rate is all about influencing the level of spending in the economy. You raise interest rates, firms are going to invest less, consumers are going to have less money to spend on goods and services. And even to some extent, it makes it harder for the government to spend because the cost of their debt is going to be higher. So it's very much quite a blunt tool, which is influencing demand. It can't, it doesn't impact on the cost of imported goods, the cost of materials, the cost of energy, because they're clearly all determined on international markets. Now, the policymakers will always say, well, we always try and look through those effects. So, if inflation went up very high, let's say because there was a huge increase in oil and gas prices again, to some extent, they wouldn't be desperately trying to increase interest rates to bring inflation back to 2%, because you realise, well, actually, we do a lot of damage to the economy. In 12 months' time, even if that oil price and gas price is the same, it's going to drop out of the index. So they always talk about inflation at the 2% target sustainably in the medium term, which I suppose, to my mind at least, and I think I'm not misinterpreting how they would describe it, is that they're trying to look through some of these shocks and say, well, if it's a temporary shock, maybe we can live with inflation being a bit above or below target, which is why they're sort of looking more focused on these domestic factors, which are sort of, in some senses, the underlying drivers of UK inflation.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And I think one of the questions that I can see that's come through sort of picks up on some elements of that last question, but sort of goes further in terms of saying, with interest rates still, let's say, relatively high, because as you quite rightly say, given historical levels, they're not necessarily that high. But with rates where they currently are, there's a sense that actually that's doing some damage to the UK economy. It's actually sort of forcing inflation to remain a little bit higher because of businesses, SMEs trying to pass on that increased cost of borrowing onto consumers and to other businesses. So is there an acknowledgement that actually rates being relatively high at this point could be doing some damage to the economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the sort of mechanism we've heard a lot from firms. Well, actually, you're raising interest rates. The labour market's really tight, so people have been able to demand higher wages, and that just means, actually, because you're impacting on household spending and so on, the labour market's tight. They can demand higher wages. and that's just fueling inflation. And of course, that is offsetting the effect. I mean, I think the sort of long-term economic evidence shows that overall, raising interest rates is an effective tool for bringing inflation down. I think it's completely fair to say that in a tight labour market, it's less effective because of that, that transmission mechanism that it means it's very hard for firms to resist increasing wages, and then they need to raise prices to try and recover some of the margin. So I think that's absolutely right. And of course, the opposite, would be the same. Interest rates would be more effective if the labour market was loose.
Have a little bit of a change of theme here then, and understandably, there's a few questions coming through in relation to the sort of political backdrop and the general election that will be coming up. So explicitly, how do you, maybe a personal view as opposed to a bank view on this one, but how do you see the upcoming general election impacting upon economic stability for the UK?
Yeah, look, I can tell you what businesses say. So I see a lot of businesses in Yorkshire and Humber. I don't get a particular sense that there's a great fear of a changing government. The polls at the moment are showing a Labour victory. I don't have a sense that firms, are worried. They seem fairly neutral. I would say, about that sort of current expectation that there would be a Labour government. I think generally firms, there's a lot of firms that are quite exposed to election uncertainty, and that they're exposed in some ways, whatever party gets in later in the year. And those are firms in things like, they're firms that face the public sector, where I suppose because there's an election coming, there's uncertainty in terms of maybe public sector spending. So big IT projects, big infrastructure projects, perhaps decision making, I think people would say, is slower than normal, and they would link that to election uncertainty. So I think it's caused a difficulty for some firms. But I guess that's something you would always see in a political cycle. That's always going to happen.
Thanks, Paul. And this next question sort of picks up on a little bit of what you've said there. Perhaps an expectation that we will have a Labour government. I think that's certainly the sort of consensus at the moment out there in the markets. Yeah, again, this may be a little bit more of a personal view than a bank view, but for whomever the next government turns out to be, what sort of room for manoeuvre do you think they've got to help rapidly improve the growth prospects for the UK?
Well, I suppose there's a reality that in historical terms, debt to GDP at the moment is pretty high, and that's not surprising with what happened during COVID and government spending needed to support the economy. So whoever's in power will have fairly limited headroom in terms of the extent to which they could sort of fiscally loosen. I mean, I think it's interesting. I'm sort of involved in a productivity forum, and it's not always how much you spend, it's how you spend it and what impact you get for that spending. So the factors, I suppose, that typically come up as needing public support would be things around, the government can have a big impact through spending on education and education policy, big impact on health services, in terms of it gets, if people are healthier, they get back into employment. We've still got a lot of people inactive and outside the labour force, particularly older workers, because partly because they're on an NHS waiting list and they're waiting for operations or for treatment. Now that again, that's maybe not surprising with COVID, but I suppose though, I suppose what I'm trying to say is limited headroom in terms of can you spend a lot more? Probably not. Can you spend it differently and maybe have a bigger impact on productivity? Of course you can, but there'll be 101 different views on what's the right thing to do, and there's obviously a lot of demands on the public purse. So I think for any government coming in, it's about spending the money as well as they can do to bolster productivity.
Okay.
I sort of dodge that one. I have to be very careful on making any comments that are political, because they are, the government is our boss effectively.
So, well, I suppose touching on that theme a little bit then, Paul, and I think what can sometimes introduce an interesting dynamic, because as you rightly say, one of the key factors that the bank looks at is things like sort of domestic wage inflation. Recently, we've certainly seen an impact on that wage inflation from the uplifts in national living wage and the increases that have been put through there. So certainly, I think that there's a sense that that has probably driven some degree of broader wage inflation as well. So does the bank have a kind of any input to the government? Would they listen in terms of the effects of what increases to national living wage might do in terms of interest rates?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on how the living wage, but well, my understanding is that it's an independent commission that come up with the recommendation, and then it's up for the government to decide whether they accept it. Now, I'm sure that one of the things the government will take into account when they do that is the impact it will have on inflation. And you would expect, I'm not party to the conversations between the governor and the chancellor clearly, but you would expect that part of their discussion at their weekly meeting, if there's just been a big recommendation for an increase in the real wage, would be that they would want to talk about that, and it would be one of the factors that a government would take into account when deciding, how high, whether to accept that recommendation. Beyond that, I don't know. There's clearly other reasons that a government will want to. There's lots of reasons why they will want to change the living wage in a particular way, not just its inflation. The impact on inflation. Certainly, a lot of firms will say, it has an impact, and it has an impact further up the wage distribution, because there is an expectation that, or there is a requirement really to keep some differentials. Because if you don't have differentials as people take on more responsibility and more skilled roles, what's the incentive to do so? Really, it kills those incentives. So it does definitely have an impact. But ultimately, it has to be a political decision, I guess, with lots of different objectives in mind, whether it's reducing inequality or if there's an impact on inflation and so on.
Sure. Okay, thanks, Paul. So again, sort of changing tack a little bit then. So a specific question here about the number and size of businesses that have been seen to be leaving the London Stock Exchange recently. Yeah, is that something that the bank would have a view on? Would they be concerned by that dynamic?
We wouldn't have I don't suppose we'd have a published corporate view, because it's not our remit in a sense. Or is it? So I'm thinking very much about monetary policy. I've got to be honest, I don't know, because we tend to work more on the inflation side. I suppose, sort of UK business access to capital, it's more of a financial stability issue, I guess. I mean, I suppose broadly from, the banks, and maybe from an economic perspective, what we want to make sure is that UK businesses can raise finance. Look, there might be reasons why we'd be concerned about UK businesses feeling that the UK stock market wasn't the place for them. I don't think I'm really well grounded enough in quite the work we do on the financial stability and side to really sort of know what those might be. I'm going to have to dodge that one a bit. I think
No,
I
I think
don't.
that's
There's
fair.
a lot of people who work at the bank on a lot of different policy areas, so I'd be sort of making it up really if I said yes or no.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, Paul. I suppose a general feeling would be that those businesses leaving, it's all about the relative attractiveness of the UK as a place to sort of host your market listing, and that will have a huge number of factors that would sort of impact upon that. Well, lots of which will be well without side of the sort of Bank of England sort of remit. So I think fair enough to move on from that one. So a question here, talking about obviously the very current news. So today's news of inflation falling to 2.3%, and maybe some talk of that sort of bringing forward an election now. Would the timing of the general election sort of have any bearing, do you think, on the bank's policy around interest rates?
No, I think is the simple answer. I think the governor was asked that at the last press conference and sort of made it very clear that we do operate independently, and that the committee's not there thinking about what the political implications might be of changing rates at a given time, and because there might be some, or there are some political implications, but that actually they take that decision based on whether they think it's the right time to change interest rates to meet their inflation target. And I generally get that sense that there is that level of independence.
Okay. We've got one more question currently just to turn to, but I suppose a bit of a final call. If anyone is thinking that they've got something they'd like to put to Paul, then please do that in the next couple of minutes or so. I suppose thinking back to one of the slides that you put on screen earlier on, Paul, was around that sort of forecast, which I appreciate that was sort of market driven, market forecast, opposed to specifically the views of the bank. But as you got towards the sort of latter end of that period, then clearly we did see sort of inflation coming down below that sort of 2% target, down to possibly sort of 1.6, yet bank rates still being, sort of 3.5% or sort of more. So yeah, again, I suppose this touches on that question earlier on a little bit about, perception of the bank being relatively slow sometimes to move on rates. But if we see an expectation of inflation falling below the 2% target, why do we still see the market believing that interest rates would need to remain, again, relatively speaking, a sort of lofty level of sort of 3.5% or more?
Yeah, I mean, I think these forecasts are very, very sensitive. So, we take certain market curves as an input to the forecast. You take where markets think the oil price is going, the gas price, and because the interest rate is probably the main driver on the equation. You feed those assumptions into your model, and it churns out some numbers essentially. They are very much black box equation driven, horribly difficult to understand statistical models that I won't pretend to understand. So if there's a sort of degree of what you might call inconsistency, then I don't think that's a surprise. You're not always going to end up with a forecast 3 years out that says, "Oh, look, inflation's dead bang on target," and here's the interest rate at a level that we might think is the long-term equilibrium. And I think probably the reality is that maybe an interest rate between 3 and 4% for a period might be more normal than having one at under 1%, which is where we've been. There's a lot of academic literature about what's the sort of, the stable, the equilibrium interest rate you would have, if there weren't always lots of shocks impacting on the economy. So yeah, I mean, I think you have to take the forecasts as they are. They will change as some of those input assumptions change, as different shocks hit the economy over the next years. Hopefully, we'll get some positive shocks as well, which would be nice, but they all seem to be negative ones at the moment. But there must be some positive ones coming as well, you'd hope.
Yeah. And you touched on this morning, Paul, about obviously how important the sort of current data that the bank is seeing feeds into that policy making, that decision making. But looking forwards, how far forward might the bank sort of be looking in terms of any sort of forecasts and projections to also influence their thinking?
Well, in terms of the forecast, we're very focused on the next 2 years, really, and that's partly because if you change interest rates today, the full impact can take up to a couple of years to come through. So it takes time for that change in rates to come in. We talked about the mortgage thing. Also, firm investment decisions. If you start raising or reducing rates, firms aren't going to change their investment intentions overnight. Some things, you're committed to, and so on. So it does take time. So that's the reason for the sort of relatively short term sort of forecast focus. I think in terms of looking longer term, we are constantly asking firms and looking at things like the impact of AI, innovation, different structural changes in the economy, maybe consumption patterns, because we sort of recognize that longer term, those will affect inflation dynamics. So there is work and focus in the bank about looking longer term. One of the great things when policymakers come to meet firms in the regions, which they do really regularly, is that they'll hear from businesses about what some of those maybe long-term issues are or long-term plans are around automation, around use of AI, and so on. So there is always a focus or a big interest on the longer term, and how the economy is changing. But ultimately, because of the remit and trying to get inflation at, at 2% in the medium term, and that sort of up to 2 year transmission mechanism, the forecasts tend to be very short term focused, and I would sort of expect that to always be the case, to be honest, in terms of a forecast.
Yeah, sure. And I suppose given that sort of outlook, that time frame that you refer to there, Paul, again, what we've spoken about already today, we are going to see a general election, probably at the closer towards the beginning of that sort of time frame. Would the bank go as far as having different sort of scenarios, different plans, depending on which party ended up coming into power?
So there would never be a plan around how we change interest rates. I mean, there might be different scenarios you could look at in the forecast. We would obviously never publish them, but I would guess if you had, let's say you had two political parties, you're about to get an election, and they had wildly different fiscal balances. If one was saying, "Oh, we're going to spend," and the other was saying, "No, we're cutting back. We're going to really tighten." I think as a monetary policy, as an interest rate setting body, you would quietly be having a word, I would think, with your staff to say, could you run that forecast model on those different assumptions for government spending? Because it's clearly going to have a huge impact, and you'd want to have in your head, I think, maybe what the impact on inflation might be. My general sense is we don't currently have two or three or however many political parties with wildly different sort of fiscal, talking about different sort of overall fiscal policies. The general sense, I think, is pretty balanced, pretty much as it is. It's more a case of how do you spend the money rather than how much do you spend, or maybe where do you raise it from rather than how much do you raise, and so on.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Paul. Look, I think that sort of brings a close to the questions that we've had submitted through. So thank you again, enlightening as always, and particularly given how sort of active and in the sort of public sort of view things like interest rates currently are, and with the backdrop of inflation. So I think it was a really timely presentation this morning. Hopefully for everyone that's joined us, that's provided some useful insight and a little bit of clarity around what's driving things and how things might sort of alter over the sort of months to come. But thank you very much for everyone taking the time to join us this morning, and a big thank you to you for giving up your time, Paul. And with that, we'll draw things to a close just a little bit before 10 a.m. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.